Over $1 billion. That's how much money moved through just one bank account tied to Jeffrey Epstein. Not hundreds of thousands, not a few million. $1 billion with a B. And the people who could explain where it came from and where it went are doing everything possible to make sure you never find out. This isn't theory. This isn't speculation. It's sitting in a file cabinet at the Treasury Department right now, and the most powerful people in Washington are fighting to keep it locked. What happens when a United States senator stands on the floor of Congress and exposes exactly what's in that file? What happens when he names names, reveals numbers, and demands answers? Silence. Complete and total silence. Because what Ron Wyden found wasn't just evidence of past crimes. It was a roadmap to present-day cover-ups involving people who still hold power, still make decisions, and still have everything to lose if the truth comes out.
4,725 wire transfers. Let me repeat that. 4,725 wire transfers, adding up to nearly $1.1 billion flowing in and out of just one of Mr. Epstein's bank accounts. If you ask me, that is more than 4,000 potential lines of investigation right there. Hundreds of millions more flowed through other accounts. That's even a lot more to investigate. The file shows that Mr. Epstein used multiple Russian banks, which are now under sanctions, to process payments related to sex trafficking. A lot of the women and girls he targeted came from Russia, Belarus, Turkey, and elsewhere. One shudders to think about the kinds of people who must have been involved in trafficking these women and young girls out of those companies and into the Epstein web of abuse. Again, these are all potential leads, Mr. President, the Department of Justice ought to be digging into. This is about years and years of international sex trafficking. None of this is a hoax. None of it is a scam. And I'd like to say I consider it insulting to the intelligence of the American people for the Trump administration to simply say there is nothing to investigate here. Now, when the Trump administration came in with a lot of fanfare about transparency and openness, I said, I'm going to follow up on that. So I wrote to the Attorney General, Ms. Bondi, Treasury Secretary Bessent, FBI Director Patel, and I asked them all to produce the Epstein file to the Senate Finance Committee so it could be reviewed. In fact, I've made that request multiple times. The Trump commitment to transparency based on the response didn't mean a whole lot because they just refused. Here's what one Treasury official wrote back to me. I'll quote here. The Department of Treasury has previously made documents available relating to the matter in response to your inquiries. Accordingly, we understand that you have the information you seek from the Treasury related to this request. We thank you for your attention to this important issue. Mr. President, for anybody who's familiar with how these discussions go in Washington, D.C., what I just read was code for the bureaucracy saying, you're asking for information, go pound sand. The Trump administration may be trying to close the books on the Epstein sex trafficking, but I want it understood as a senior member of the Senate Finance Committee, where we spend a lot of time looking at where substantial sums of money are going, particularly if they may be promoting wrongdoing and helping to evade taxes. We are going to stay on this fight to hold the wealthy individuals accountable for the harm that they clearly were involved in injuring the young women and others in this sex trafficking. So I'm going to have more follow-up for Attorney General Bondi very quickly. As for today, Mr. President, if she doesn't want to do the investigating, doesn't want the DOJ to do it. Let me just restate my original demand. Have that Treasury information given to the Senate Finance Committee and have us on a bipartisan basis do our work. That's what we do in important investigations. If the Trump people believe they need additional authority to carry out the requests that I make again this afternoon, let me offer to help them write the bill myself. The idea that there is nothing more to investigate, not when you have 4,000 wire transfers, many of them associated with the possibility of wrongdoing and sex traffic promoting. The idea that you have that and there's nothing to investigate when it comes to the Epstein sex trafficking operation is ridiculous. Pam Bondi was the Attorney General in the state of Florida, where a lot of the Epstein crimes were committed. The Attorney General ought to know better, of all people. Mr. President, I can't begin to understand the President's handling of this or why he thinks this is just going to go away. But I'm here to say that our investigators have spent 3 full years looking into this. And the reason why is because we feel so strongly about the horror of sex trafficking and our commitment to root it out. The President of the Senate is new to this body, but I'm sure he's dealt with these issues before. You can't have a much bigger horror in front of you than sex trafficking abuse. So we're talking about real evil done to women and girls by Jeffrey Epstein. And Mr. President, nobody gets to sweep that under the rug. I yield the floor.
Senator Ron Wyden didn't stumble into this investigation by accident. He spent 3 full years following the money, tracking patterns, and piecing together one of the most disturbing financial networks ever documented. His team at the Senate Finance Committee had one job: figure out how Epstein built his empire and who helped him do it. What they discovered was beyond anything they imagined. The Treasury Department had compiled a massive file on Epstein's financial activities, and when Wyden finally got access to portions of it, the numbers made his blood run cold. 725 wire transfers. Let that sink in for a moment. Not a dozen suspicious transactions. Not even a few hundred. Nearly 5,000 separate movements of money, all flowing in and out of a single bank account. When you add them all up, the total comes to $1.1 billion. That's more money than most people will see in multiple lifetimes, and it was moving through the financial system with apparently no one asking questions. But here's what makes it even more disturbing. That was just one account. Epstein had multiple accounts, and hundreds of millions more flowed through those as well. Each transfer represented a potential lead, a possible connection, a thread that could unravel the entire web. Wyden stood in front of his colleagues and laid it out plainly. These weren't normal business transactions. These weren't investments or legitimate deals. The patterns showed something else entirely. Money coming from places it shouldn't. Money going to people who had no obvious reason to be connected. And every single one of those 4,725 transfers was a question waiting to be answered. Who sent it? Who received it? What was it for? Those questions should have launched thousands of investigations. Instead, they launched a cover-up. The details got darker the deeper Wyden dug. It wasn't just the amount of money that raised red flags. It was where the money was moving. Multiple Russian banks appeared throughout the records, institutions that are now under international sanctions. These weren't mainstream financial centers. They were the kind of banks you use when you don't want anyone looking too closely at your business. And Epstein used them constantly, processing payments that investigators believe were directly tied to trafficking operations. Think about what that means for a second. Russian banks, sanctions, trafficking payments. This wasn't some domestic scandal that stayed within American borders. This was an international operation with tentacles reaching across continents. The Treasury documents showed money flowing to and from Russia, Belarus, Turkey, and other countries where Epstein recruited many of his victims. Young women and girls were being moved across borders, and the financial records proved it. Every wire transfer was evidence. Every account was a trail. And somewhere in those records were the names of people who facilitated it all. Wyden described it as shuddering to think about who must have been involved. Because you don't move people across international borders without help. You don't process millions through foreign banks without connections. You don't build a network that's sophisticated without powerful allies who know exactly what they're doing and choose to look the other way. The paper trail didn't just show Epstein's crimes. It showed the infrastructure that made those crimes possible. And that infrastructure didn't disappear when Epstein died. It's still out there, still operating, still protected. But Senator Wyden had documentation. He had proof. He had numbers that couldn't be argued away or dismissed as conspiracy theories. So he did what any responsible investigator would do. He went to the people in charge and demanded they act on the evidence. He wrote to Attorney General Pam Bondi. He wrote to Treasury Secretary Bessent. He wrote to FBI Director Kash Patel. His request was simple and direct. Turn over the complete Epstein file to the Senate Finance Committee so Congress could review it and determine what needed to be investigated. Transparency, right? That's what everyone claims to want. That's what the administration had promised. The response he got back was insulting. Treasury officials sent him a letter that barely qualified as an acknowledgement. They claimed they had already provided documents related to his previous inquiries. They suggested that he already had the information he was seeking. Then they thanked him for his attention to this important issue, and that was it. End of conversation. In Washington, everyone knows what that kind of letter means. It's bureaucratic code for go away. It's the polite version of telling a United States senator to pound sand. They weren't going to give him anything more. They weren't going to cooperate. And they definitely weren't going to let Congress see the full file. Wyden wasn't having it. He went back to the Senate floor and called them out directly. He read their response aloud so everyone could hear exactly how the administration was handling a billion-dollar trafficking investigation. He made it crystal clear that this wasn't about politics. This wasn't a partisan attack. This was about following evidence of international crimes and holding people accountable. But instead of transparency, he got stonewalling. Instead of cooperation, he got form letters. The people who promised openness were now doing everything they could to keep the truth buried. And then Wyden dropped a name that made the whole situation even more uncomfortable. Pam Bondi. She wasn't just the current attorney general who was refusing to hand over files. She had a history with this case that made her resistance particularly disturbing. Before taking her position in Washington, Bondi had been the attorney general of Florida. And Florida was where many of Epstein's original crimes took place. His estate was there. His victims were there. The initial investigations happened on her watch, in her state, under her jurisdiction. If anyone should understand the scope and horror of what Epstein did, it should be Pam Bondi. If anyone should be demanding full investigations and complete transparency, it should be her. Instead, she was blocking access to the very documents that could reveal who else was involved. Wyden pointed this out plainly. He said Bondi ought to know better than anyone. But knowing better doesn't always mean doing better, especially when the people being protected are powerful enough to end careers. The question hung in the air like smoke after an explosion. Why would someone with first-hand knowledge of these crimes refuse to investigate further? What could possibly justify looking at 4,125 suspicious wire transfers and deciding there's nothing worth pursuing? Unless, of course, pursuing those leads would expose people she'd rather keep hidden. Unless the investigation would create problems for allies, donors, or political figures who benefit from the truth staying locked away. That's when refusal to investigate stops being incompetence and starts looking like protection. The 3 years Wyden's team spent investigating weren't wasted. They built a case that's airtight. They found the money trails. They documented the connections. They identified the banks and the jurisdictions and the patterns that prove this wasn't isolated criminal activity. This was systematic, organized, and protected at the highest levels. And now that they've compiled all that evidence, the people who should be most interested in pursuing it are the ones slamming doors in their faces. That tells you everything you need to know about whose interests are being protected. It's not the victims. It's not the public. It's not justice or accountability or any of the principles politicians love to talk about during campaigns. It's the people whose names are in those files. The people who knew what Epstein was doing and either participated or looked the other way. The people who have enough power to make senators back down and investigations disappear, but Wyden isn't backing down. He ended his floor speech with a promise. He's going to keep fighting until the Treasury file is opened. He's going to keep demanding transparency until someone provides it. He's going to keep reminding Congress and the public that this evidence exists, and that refusing to act on it is a choice. A choice to protect predators over victims. A choice to value political convenience over justice. A choice that says some people are too powerful to be held accountable no matter what they've done. The billion-dollar question isn't really about the money. It's about what that money represents. It's about who it connects and what they're willing to do to keep those connections hidden. Every wire transfer is a name. Every offshore account is a potential co-conspirator. Every blocked investigation is proof that the cover-up is ongoing. And every day those files stay locked is another day the people responsible get away with it. This isn't ancient history. This is happening right now. Federal officials are actively blocking congressional oversight. Documents that should be public are being classified. Investigations that should be ongoing are being shut down. And all of it is happening in plain sight, while those same officials claim they support transparency and accountability. The contradiction would be laughable if the subject matter weren't so horrifying. Wyden made one thing absolutely clear in his speech. This isn't going away. He's a senior member of the Senate Finance Committee, which means he has authority to investigate financial crimes and tax evasion. He has jurisdiction. He has resources. And he has the evidence to prove that something massive is being covered up. The question now is whether he has enough political support to force truth into the open, or whether the machinery of power will grind his efforts down until the public forgets and moves on to the next scandal, because that's what usually happens, isn't it? A shocking revelation gets attention for a few days or weeks. People express outrage on social media. News cycles move on, and nothing actually changes. The powerful stay powerful, the connected stay connected, and the victims stay forgotten. That's what those blocking the investigation are counting on. They're betting that if they stonewall long enough, the public will lose interest and Wyden will eventually give up. But here's what makes this different. The evidence isn't going away. Those Treasury files exist whether anyone looks at them or not. The wire transfers happened. The banks processed them. The money moved. And somewhere in federal databases are records that could change everything we think we know about power and corruption in America. The question is whether enough people care to demand those records see daylight. Wyden certainly cares. He's staking his reputation on this investigation. He's calling out his own government for covering up crimes. He's naming officials who are blocking transparency. That's not the move of someone looking for headlines. That's the move of someone who's seen evidence so damning that staying silent would be unthinkable. When a senator with decades of experience stands on the floor of Congress and says we're looking at real evil and nobody gets to sweep that under the rug, you better believe he means it. The machinery that protected Epstein didn't die with him. It's still running, still protecting people, still moving money, still silencing victims. The difference now is that someone with actual power is refusing to play along. Someone who can't be easily dismissed or discredited. Someone with access to classified information and the authority to demand answers. That's why this investigation matters. Not because it might reveal shocking truths, though it almost certainly will, but because it proves the system can still be challenged if someone is brave enough to try. So what happens next? That depends on whether Congress decides to actually do its job. The Senate Finance Committee has the authority to subpoena those Treasury documents. They can hold hearings. They can compel testimony. They can make the refusal to cooperate so politically expensive that officials have no choice but to hand over the files. Or they can do what they usually do, which is talk a lot, hold a few symbolic votes, and ultimately let the whole thing fade away. The $1 billion is still sitting there. The 4,625 wire transfers are still documented. The Russian banks are still identified. The trafficking routes are still mapped. And the names are still hidden. Every single piece of that puzzle is locked in government files right now, protected not by classification or national security concerns, but by political calculation. By powerful people who know that transparency would destroy them. By a system that values protection of elites over justice for victims. Wyden's speech wasn't just an expose. It was a challenge. He's daring the administration to keep blocking him. He's daring Congress to ignore the evidence. He's daring the public to stay informed and keep demanding answers. Because if we don't, if we let this get buried under the next news cycle, then we're saying it's okay. We're saying some people really are above the law. We're saying victims don't matter if their abusers have enough money and connections. The truth is sitting in a locked file cabinet somewhere in Washington. A $1 billion paper trail that could expose one of the most powerful criminal networks ever documented. And the only thing standing between that truth and the public is political will. The question isn't whether the evidence exists. We know it does. The question is whether anyone with power will have the courage to release it. And whether the rest of us will demand they do. This story isn't over. It's just beginning. Because now we know what's being hidden and who's hiding it. Now we know the numbers, the banks, the countries involved. Now we know that when officials promise transparency, they mean it only until that transparency threatens the wrong people. And now we know that Senator Ron Wyden isn't backing down, which means this fight is far from finished. The $1 billion question remains. Who gets protected and who gets justice? The answer should be obvious. But in Washington, nothing is ever that simple.